Today's daf we're going to be learning is Kiddushin Daf Yud Gimel. This is the daf for Shabbat. We're going to get started with a review of the end of yesterday's daf. So what we saw in the previous daf was Rava, who came and said that we had a case where a woman was given a mat, a mat made of reeds by her husband. He said to her, with this, you're betrothed. It was not worth a pruta, but then he said to her, in it is 4 zuz, and that's what I meant to betroth you by. So the question is, when she keeps it at that point, is she betrothed or not? Rava says, listen, when he said to her, you were betrothed in the beginning, she didn't actually think she was betrothed because it wasn't worth anything. She didn't know the 4 zuz was inside. When he later said, be betrothed to me with the 4 zuz that are inside, at that point she kept it, but she didn't necessarily keep it for the purpose of kiddushin. This is what you call accepting it after the money was already given. Right? The acceptance of the money was given without her thinking that there was an actual betrothal there. Called Itchtikuta de la'achar matan ma'ot. Her silence, the whole question is, how do we translate her silence? Was she accepting it or was she not accepting it? So since the silence was after the money was already given, we view that as this is not considered an acceptance of his proposal, his marriage offer. So Rava says, what's my proof? And he brings this braita, kinsi sela zoba pikadon, accept this sela for a pikadon, meaning I want you to watch over this for me, different case. I want you to watch over this. And then he said, oh, you know what? Keep it and be betrothed to me with it. So if he said, keep it at the moment he gave her the item, first he said, I want you to watch something. And then he gave it to her and said, betroth me with it. And she accepted it. Then obviously she's mekudeshet. But if she didn't, but if he gave it to her after matan ma'ot, if he said it, be betrothed to me with this after he had already given her the money, then it all depends on whether she wanted it or didn't want it. She ratzta or lo ratzta. Wanted, didn't want. Now we have to understand, what does it mean wanted, didn't want? So the Gemara says, okay, let's start 3 lines from the bottom of your bed and my bed at the very last word on the line. My ratzta, my lo ratzta. What does it mean wanted or didn't want? Ileman, here I'm going to pull up today's study guide. There's a study guide to help guide you here. If it's that she said ratzta means yes and lo ratzta means no, well, that can't possibly be because Michlal Dereisha, remember the first part said, if it was at the time of the giving of the money, she's betrothed, whether she wanted it or didn't want it. Now, if didn't want it means she didn't want the betrothal at all, and she said no. Well, ki amra lo nami havu kiddushin amai v'haka amra lo. There's no way that saying no would actually work. So since the second part of the braita says, well, after he gives the money, it really depends if she wanted it or not. You can't say that not wanting it said no, because in the first part, when it says, when he gave her the money, she's betrothed, even if she said no, that would not work at all. Right? V'haka amra lo, she said no. So it can't possibly be that. So they reject the first option here. The ratzda is she said yes, and lo ratzda is she said no. To which they say, El alav, it must be ratzda de amra'in, lo ratzda de ishtika mishtika. Ratzda means yes, she said yes. Lo ratzda, which we're going to say she's not betrothed, is she was silent. Now, what do you notice here? If she's silent, she's not betrothed. That's the conclusion. Mushmamina. Now, why would she not be betrothed? Because okay, because what does it prove from here? Silence, if it's not at the moment the money was given, it was after the moment the money was given. Again, in this case, he gave her a sela to say and said, watch this money. And then he said later, when she already had the money, betroth me with this, and she doesn't say anything. That's not an acceptance of the marriage proposal because it's after the money was given and she just kept it. So now we're going to try to understand why did she just keep it then? And what exactly is going on? So the first thing we're going to have is a question on this psak halacha of Rav. So I'm going to keep the charts open here. So in Pum Nara, in the name of Rav Huna B'reit Rav Yeshua, they say, we have a problem with this because you're making a comparison between 2 totally different cases. Midame, are these cases the same? Again, we have our case with the man who gave her the mat for a betrothal and then said, oh, but, by the way, there's actually 4 zuzim in the middle, right inside. She didn't know that at the time. She thought it wasn't worth anything when he gave it to her, and she kept it and didn't say anything. And the bride, where he gives her something to watch, and then she doesn't return it to him when she finds out he's just trying to betroth her with it. So the question is this: why was she silent in each case, and can it really be viewed in the same way? So comes the people in Pumnara who basically quote Rav Huna B'Rei Rav Yehoshua and say the following: these are not the same. Hatam there, but Torek Pikadonya Havinu Niala. In the Pikadon case, in the Braita case, that's here, okay, he gave it to her to watch. Now, we're going to get to Nezikin, that's our next Seder Nezikin, and we're going to learn all about laws of Shomrim when we get to Bava Metzia. When you watch something, what's the story? You assume responsibility, and you're responsible until it gets back into the other person's hands. So let's say the man says to her, listen, the money I gave you to watch, it's actually going to be yours for betrothal. She doesn't want to be betrothed with it. So what could she do? She could throw it back at him. But why doesn't she do that? What's the reason why she keeps it? Well, she might have an ulterior motive. She might say, Savara, she might say, Ishadina lehu mitavre, if I give it back to him, like, or throw it at him, or even just give it back to him, and it breaks, I'm going to be responsible. Mechayavna. I'm going to be mechayavna behu. I'm going to be responsible for them. So I don't want to give him his money back right now because I assume responsibility. He can come and take it. But when he comes and takes it, great, that I won't be responsible anymore. But if I give it back to him and say, listen, I don't want your money, what if they break? He'll make me responsible to return him the value. But but in our case, she accepted it for a betrothal proposal. So she didn't accept any level of responsibility. She just throws it back and says, listen, thanks, but no thanks. I don't want your betrothal. V'isa de lo nichale, right? If she really doesn't want it, lishtinu, she'll throw it. And what's the difference? Now, this answer, this or response to Rava, and says basically, Rava, I don't agree with you. And really, if she's silent here in the Kiddushin case, I think that you're right. And she's really, Rava says, if she's really silent in the Kiddushin case, we view that just as the other case. And Rav Huna B'Rei Rav Yehoshua says, what are you talking about? Those are two totally different cases. You can't compare them. In the Kiddushin case, I think her silence is translated as I accept the Kiddushin, which means, now we're not really sure she's betrothed. We don't know for sure that she accepted it, but we have to be stringent and assume that she's at least betrothed ad v'dao, like we've seen in cases before. To which comes another person, Parech Rav Achai, and says, wait a minute, Rav Huna B'Rei Rav Yehoshua, that's not a good difficulty that you're raising against Rava, because your difficulty assumes that what? That women know the difference between shomrim, that are assume responsibility, or someone who's watching someone's object, and this woman who accepted this betrothal proposal who is not responsible for damages or anything that would happen to him. So he says the following: Atu kulu nashe dina gemira. What, you think all the women, this is a great line, right? You think all the women know the laws? They're not all learning daf yomi. They don't all know the difference between shomrim and just that she got it as betrothal. She might actually think, hachanami, also in our case, in the betrothal case, savra isha dina lu mitavre mechayavna b'achriyutayu. She might say, if I throw it back to him and it breaks, I might be liable for damages. And therefore, she might not return it for no really good reason, not because she's really accepting the betrothal proposal, not for no good reason, but because she's worried it might break. So therefore, Rav Achai supports Rava against Rav Huna B'Rei Rav Yehoshua's question. To which now, Shalcha Rav Acha bar Rav l'kamei de Ravina. So Rav Acha bar Rav sends to Ravina, ki agavna mai. So what would be the story if this really happened? Shalach le, he sends a really interesting answer. He says the following. Anam lo shmialan had Rav Huna B'Rei Rav Yehoshua. We never heard this difficulty that he raised against Rava. But atun deshmia lechu chushula. This is very interesting. This is how psak works, at least sometimes, right? This is why it's interesting. You can learn better how to paskin by learning Gemara, because it says the following. It says, listen, we only heard Rava. We never heard the difficulty raised against Rava. So we have no concern for Rav Huna B'Rei Rav Yehoshua. So we think, like Rava said, she's not betrothed. This isn't a betrothal at all. No different from the Pikadon case, in the case where she was asked to watch it. But you can't ignore that question because you heard it. You heard it quoted by the Rav Huna B'Rei Rav Yehoshua. So you have to be concerned. So if it happens in your court, you'd have to rule to basically say it's Kiddushin out of doubt. We, who never really heard that difficulty, even though now we heard that difficulty, which is interesting, right? What it means exactly to have heard it. But we do not have to worry about it. Okay, very interesting type of answer. Next story. We had a whole bunch of stories. In yesterday's daf, now we're continuing with the stories, situations. There was a woman. So she was, I'm sorry, there was a woman who was selling belts. And he grabbed a belt of hers. She said, give it to me. He says, if I give it back to you, will you be betrothed to me? This sounds very similar to those stories we saw a number of dapim ago, where he's kind of toying with her, right? And he says, oh, I'll give it back, but will you be betrothed to me? So she takes it back and she's silent. Now, you would logically say she obviously wasn't accepting this as a marriage proposal, and also based on the sugya we saw previously. Well, let's see. She could say, yeah, I took my own, and what I took was mine, not yours. You didn't betroth me with this at all, and therefore should not betrothed at all. So Rav Nachman's answer is the obvious answer we would have thought. But Eitivei Rava le Rav Nachman. Rava brings a difficulty with Rav Nachman from a bright. These are three different types of methods of stealing, but he betroths her with some sort of stolen item. Or very similar to our case, he grabs a coin out of her hand, a sela, and he betroths her with it. He gives it back to her. She is mikudeshet. So what do you see here? That goes directly up against what you just said. If he's returning to her own item, she's not betrothed. This says she is betrothed. To which Rav Nachman answers, that was different. Hatam b'dishadich. There it must be that they already had made arrangements to be betrothed, and then he took something from her and gave it back, which is basically she must have been willing to accept that he took it from her in order that he'd have something then to betroth her with. Maybe he didn't have any money. So since they had already prearranged the marriage or the betrothal, therefore, when he gives it to her, it's counted as a betrothal. And our case was not where there was any betrothal discussed previously. Now, Rav Nachman can't just pull this out of a hat. It's a bit of all of a sudden, where does he get this? Well, minat timra deshanelam ben shadich delo shadich. He says, and where do I get it that I can make this distinction? And he's going to raise another contradiction. Ditanya. Amar Lakins, he's now going to raise a contradiction between the Kicha B'Gezel case and this case that we're going to see right now. Amar Lakins si selazo shani chayav lechi. He says, take this money that I owe you. V'chazar v'amar la yitkatshili bo. And then he says, and you know what? Keep the money and I'll be betrothed to you with this. Okay. So first he says, take this sell I owe you. And then he says, I'm actually going to use it for betrothal. Now remember, it was her money to begin with. So what does it say here? Bishat matam ma'ot. We're going to have a similar distinction as before. And I'm going to bring up the study guide again. I'm going to see this. If it was right at the time of the giving of the money, then it depends. Okay, remember the previous case. If it was at the time of the giving of the money, the first case we started with today, with when he gave her the mat, and then he mentioned, oh, by the way, there's enough to get married with. We said no matter what, she's mekudesh. Here we're going to distinguish between ratzta and lo ratzta in the early stage. If it was when he gave her the money, when he gave her back her sela, and he said, but I want you to be betrothed with this, ratzta mekudeshet, lo ratzta ina mekudeshet. It all depends on what she wanted. If she wanted it, she's mekudeshet. Didn't want it, she's not mekudeshet. Again, we're going to go through what does it mean, lo ratzta. We'll get there soon. But lachar matam ma'ot, if it was after he had already given the money, he paid her back the sela, and they said, by the way, the money I gave you back, I want to betroth you with it. Afilu ratzta ina mekudeshet. Even if she wants, she's not betrothed. Now, my ratzta, my lo ratzta. So what's this ratzta and not ratzta? Ilema ratzta da amra'in. That's always going to be the case. Ratzta means she says yes. Lo ratzta da amra lo. And then lo ratzta would be no. Again, we're going to reject this option. Ha'ishtaka. Now, the assumption would be if lo ratzta, she's not mekudeshet, we would assume that what? Ha'ishtaka havu kiddushin. But if she was silent, it would actually work. Now, if she's silent, so again, if she says yes, or she's silent, it works. Well, that's exactly like the previous case we saw today, where he says, take the pikadon, right? And then he said, be betrothed to me. He said, be betrothed to me with it as he was giving her the money and she accepted the money, she's mekudeshet. Again, whether she said yes or whether she was silent. So if that's the case, it should have just simply said here, mekudeshet. If it's at the time of the giving of the money, she's betrothed. Because whether she says yes or whether she's just silent, she accepted and knew what she was accepting. And it doesn't say that. So that's what they're going to say here. If ha'ishtakavu kiddusha, the assumption made from here would be that if you had said lo ratzta, means she said no, she's not mekudeshet, and then anything short of that she would be, well then silence, she would be mekudeshet. Nitni mekudeshet stam ki hatam. It should have said mekudeshet just before, if he does it before the giving of the money. She's betrothed, right? Unless, of course, she says no. But of course, if she says no, she won't be betrothed because she said no. So it should have just said mekudeshet like the previous case. Therefore, it must not be the case. Ela ratzta amrain, lo ratzta ishtika. And what do we see here? If she's silent, it's not a betrothal, right? Even if he says it at the time he's giving her the money, I'm giving you your sela back, and with this money I'm betrothing you, and she takes it. She's not mekudeshet if she doesn't say anything. Why? Well, the katane de ena mekudeshet. Now, why it says there she's not mekudeshet? Why not? My timer, in right? The reason why ishtaka would mean it's not kiddushin is because she could say, I was just taking my own money back. I didn't want to accept your marriage proposal. But what's the problem? And this is where we get to, again, why are we here? Try to remember. We're here because they wanted to prove from here, how did Rav Nachman know to distinguish between shadich and lo shadich? So now they say, elakasha. Well, now if we say that Kinsi Selazeh, she's not mekudeshet. And the reason is because she was just silent, didn't say anything. It was the time of the giving of the money. Well, it would be the exact same thing in that other sprite we just saw. If she betroths her with stolen items, he betroths her with stolen items, or he grabs something from her hand, money from her hand, and gives it to her and says, with this, you're betrothed, she's mekudeshet. So these two stand in total contradiction to each other. One says she's betrothed, one says she's not betrothed. Therefore, the only way to resolve this contradiction, claims Rav Nachman, again, you could say these are different opinions, but it must be our brighter with the sela is he didn't make any previous arrangement, and Katav Salam Yadam Mekudeshet is where she had already arranged with him the whole marriage proposal, in which case she's obviously agreeing to the marriage proposal. And that's how Rav Nachman proves, again, he answers the difficulty that Rava raised against him from this Kitcha B'Gazelu B'Chamas and all that, because he said that case is when it was Shadich versus the Sela case where it was obviously not Shadich. And that's why they hadn't made any previous arrangement. So the whole first section of our daf was finishing up these stories that we saw. Both had a very similar structure of trying to figure out what Ratztan, Lo Ratztan, these different brightot meant. And from there we got to which cases, right? What happens when the woman's silent? How do we translate her silent? Is it the same in every case? Does it depend on the circumstances? We saw Machloket in the previous story. And here we see Rav Nachman's approach to it in this story. Now we're going to move on to something else, which will relate to marriage somewhat, but we're now going to talk about Kinach Nafshe de Rabbi Asi or Rav Asi. Sometimes it appears as Rav, sometimes Rebbe. Anyway, he was an Emorah in Israel. Likely he was Rebbe. When he died, the rabbis wanted to collect his Torah. So they started asking anyone who could come forward who knew some Torah that he had said. So this Rabbi Yaakov character comes over and says the following. We're going to have 3 different testimonials of people about things he said. 2 are related directly to our topic, 1 really not. Okay, this starts off with our topic. Just like a woman can't be betrothed for less than a pruta, you also can't buy land for less than a shava pruta. Now, land in general is worth more, but let's say, just like you put a down payment down, your down payment has to be at least a pruta. What do you mean? They said to, but it says in a braita that different from betrothal. Betrothal has to be a pruta. Land could be acquired for less than a pruta. To which they answer, Amalei, Kitanya hiba chalipin. That's by chalipin. Tanya, as it says, konim bekli va'apapi she'en bo sheva pruta. You can use a kli to acquire something. This is what we call, right, a symbolic act. Like usually we take a handkerchief. Even if the handkerchief isn't worth a pruta, it's fine. So land can be acquired either by kesef, I gave money. There's different ways land is acquired. I'm just talking about now the paying of the money. Or we could do a kinyan chalipin. We could lift a handkerchief, which isn't even worth a pruta. That can be done. But if I'm paying in kesef, money, and I'm acquiring it by paying, then it has to be at least approved. So that's how we resolve the first difficulty, or the difficulty that we raised with this first statement of Rabbi Asi. Second statement, Hadar Yatve B'Kamre. They continued to sit and they said the following. Hada Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Okay, both this one and the next one, I'm going to start with Shmuel and then get to Rabbi Asi. Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, Kol she'eino yodea b'tiv gitin b'kiddushin, lo yehelo esek imahem. We saw this comment before. Anyone who doesn't know all the laws of gitin and kiddushin should not rule in any of these cases, should not be involved in a divorce or anything else because they might make a mistake. And then the woman perhaps will be a married woman and will go marry somebody else against the law. Amar Rabbi Asi, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, b'kashin olam yoter midor mabul. So Rabbi Asi here doesn't disagree with him. He actually just adds. And he says, doing this, if you go against this rule and you're in a court and you rule without really knowing all the halachot, you're causing destruction that's worse than the destruction caused by those in the time of the flood. Okay, all those people who are involved in terrible behavior, which caused God to decide to destroy almost the entire world. So why is this worse? Shenema. Well, the main reason why it's worse is because it causes adultery and it causes mamzerim. And now we're going to see how we know in these psukim from Hosea, chapter 4, verses 2 and 3. We're going to see how this shows that doing this actually causes a destruction that's worse than the destruction in the time of the flood. Allah v'kachash v'ratzoach v'ganov v'ni'uf paratzu v'damim v'damim nagav. Okay, swearing, right, like swearing falsely, or using the name of God in vain, maybe. V'kachash, denying claims, murdering, stealing, adultery, have exploded. Okay, we'll talk about that word in a minute. V'damim v'damim nagav, when blood to blood is touched. Okay, what this means, right? Blood will touch other blood. My mashma, how do we get from this pasuk about the destruction? By the way, the next pasuk is al kain te'aval haaretz. From here, the land will be destroyed. Everyone who's living in the land will be in bad shape, etc. Okay, and then it says okay, all the animals and the fish are going to be collected, meaning basically everyone will die out. So they say the following. How do we get it from this pasuk? Rav Yosef, as Rav Yosef translated this pasuk. Muladin banim minashe chavrehon. When children are born, ne'of paratzu means exploding, means like a population explosion. When children are born from men with their friends' wives, meaning adultery, chovin al chovin mosifim. Dabim nagau, blood by blood will be touched, means we're going to add on sin upon sin, because people will then end up marrying these kids who are mamzerim, and then they'll have mamzerim, and then they'll marry mamzerim. This will cause terrible things to happen. Now, people will sin and sin and sin. And then what does it say in the next pasuk? As I said, this will cause a total and utter destruction in the land, among the people, among the animals, and among the fish. Now, why is this worse than the generation of the flood? The fish weren't included in the whole decree. Everyone on dry land died, but not the fish in the sea. And here, even the fish in the sea. So here you see how terrible it'll be. Now they say, wait a minute, that pasuk wasn't only talking about adultery, it was talking about all sorts of other things. Maybe it's only the world's going to be destroyed when all those things are done. And it even says, and this, and this, and this, and that. Lo sakadat. No, we don't think so. Dichtiv ki mipnei Allah avla haaretz. Now we quote a different pasuk from Yirmiyahu where it says, on false oaths, the land will be destroyed, which means that each of these things independently can cause destruction of the world, including the adultery. To which they say, ve'ema Allah lechud v'hanach lechudeon. Maybe it's only the cursing which on its own will cause the destruction, and all the rest only together. Now turning to Amud Bet, to which they say, well, note the way the pasuk is worded. Miktiv uparatzu. It doesn't say, now notice, I told you. It says, again, let's read it inside. Allah v'kachash, en kachash, v'ratza, v'ganov, v'ne'uf paratzu. Now there's no vav by the word uparatzu. So they say paratzu ktiv, which means that the paratzu is referring back to the ne'uf. Ne'uf paratzu. Adultery will cause this explosion of children, which will then cause mamzerim problems, which will cause many people to sin. And that's what the end of that pasuk is referring to. And that's what by itself can actually cause the destruction. Okay, that was the number two thing that Rabbi Asi said that we now quoted, again, one was about land being acquired with something that has to be, if you're paying a down payment, it has to be at least a pruta if you want to acquire that land with that sale and with that action. And the second thing is that the world will be destroyed because, right, he said, if you have people who don't really know the laws well and they're dealing with cases of divorce and betrothals, that will cause also these problems of, right, married women who are marrying other men because they weren't judged properly, the get wasn't done properly, and then you'll have a huge problem on your hands. And that will cause destruction of the world because many people will sin. Third statement of Rabbi Asi, totally different topic. We now have a woman who's supposed to bring, let's say had a baby, she's supposed to bring a korban, chatat, and olah. What happens? She brings her sin offering. She's now supposed to bring the burnt offering, but she dies. So now what's supposed to happen? Do her heirs have to bring a korban in her place? She was already obligated, and on the other hand, she's no longer here. Yaviu Yorshim Olata. So they are supposed to bring her korban olah. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel, it depends, he says. It's only, there's two options. Either she was just obligated to bring a korban and that's where it ended. She didn't do anything further. Then comes Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel, she wouldn't have to bring. But if she already separated the animal to be brought as a sacrifice, then we can use it as a sacrifice, okay? Because it's a burnt offering could always be brought as a voluntary offering. So he says if she had already designated the animal when she was alive, then the heirs need to bring it. But if she hadn't designated it yet in her lifetime, then the heirs wouldn't have to bring it at all. There'd basically be no obligation anymore. Alma kasaval, from here you can infer that what does he hold? Shiabud alav de'oraitu. Now again on a totally different topic, which why would they have to bring it? If let's say she didn't designate the animal. Once the animal's sanctified, there's nothing else you could do with it. It can only be brought as korban olah, so bring it anyway. But if she didn't designate it, theoretically, she was already obligated. Now, once you have a Torah obligation, perhaps your land is already, or your money is already designated for that. That's what's called the shibud. There's a lien on your property for that obligation you have. Comes Rabbi Yehuda in the name of Shmuel and says there is no such thing. Shibud, the fact that my property is liened to this obligation, is not a Torah law. So basically, your property is not liened to it, in which case the heirs don't have to bring it because she no longer has an obligation. She's no longer here, and the animal wasn't separated yet. So there's no lien on her property, which means the heirs don't need to bring it. Amar Rabbi Asi, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, he says, even if, okay, this is Rabbi Asi talking in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. We're going to go back to Rabbi Yochanan, so pay attention. The first opinion was Shmuel, quoted in the name of Shmuel, and this one's quoted in the name of Rabbi Yochanan. Even if she didn't designate the animal when she was still alive, they still have to bring it. Why is that? He obviously holds the opposite. Alma kasavar shibuda have deoraita. Shibud is by Torah law. In other words, she has an obligation. Her property is already committed to paying this. So even if she dies, the obligation already hit in because she gave birth. So she now, the property has to pay for it. Okay, so the children have to pay for it. So he says, so now the Gemara says, why are you mentioning this whole thing in this context? Shmuel and Rabbi Yochanan actually argue about this somewhere else, whether shibud is Torah law or not Torah. The general case where lien on property comes in is if I loan you money and you need to pay me back and you have no money to pay me back, but you have land, but the land you sold to somebody else. So if you sold that land to somebody else after we took out the loan, that person, first of all, should have checked to see if there were any liens on your property, right? But that property is liened to my loan. So if you sell it to someone else, I can collect it back from that person. So now they say, Rav Shmuel da Amrei Travayu milva al peh eino goveh min hayorshim velo min halekuchot. Rabbi Yochanan Rish Lakish da Amrei Travayu milva al peh goveh min hayorshim velo min halekuchot. This is the exact same machlok. If we did not write our IOU in a document, but we just had an oral agreement. I loaned you money. You said you pay me back. That's it. We never wrote it down. According to Shmuel and Rav, okay, Rav isn't important for our purposes here, but it's important in general just to know he held like Shmuel. that basically if I can't go collect that money if you were to die from your heirs. And I can't collect that money if you sold it to somebody else. Why is that? Generally, we say, right? Well, we'll see in a minute. But right now, let's just say because what? Because shibud is not by Torah law. So basically, by Torah law, I don't have any sort of lien on your property. But Rabbi Yochanan, Rish Lakish, Amrei Travayu, they both held that milva I'll pay, even if it was just an oral agreement, I can collect it. Bein min hayorshim, either from your heirs, or bein min halekuchot, or from people that you sold land to. So now, why do we need both? We need them both. Why? To eat marbaha, if you just had the first case about the, if you had the second case, just make sure I'm getting this right before I start so I don't confuse something. Eat marbaha, right. If we just had it about the milva, about the loan, what would you say? If we only had it by a loan, you would say, oh, well, it doesn't say in the Torah anywhere that you have to repay a loan. Aval b'hach, and therefore there's no shibud. But in the Yoleda case where the Torah obligated you to bring the korban, ema modelu Rabbi Yochanan, Rish Lakish, maybe Shmuel would agree with Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish that your heirs have to pay the money. Okay, because there is a shibud. Now, what does it mean it wasn't in the Torah that you have to pay a loan? It actually does talk about paying back loans. So Tosfot has very interesting Tosfot. Tosfot says, what does it mean, milva k'tuva b'torah? What are things that are written in the Torah? He says like korbanot, pidyon haben, okay, obligations of sacrifices. The fact that a firstborn son has to be redeemed. Erchin, if you give the value of a person to the temple, so there's a value in the Torah. Nizikin, what you have to pay for damages. If the Torah hadn't specified these in particular, you wouldn't have known you had to pay them. That's called something written in the Torah. But a milveh. Now, if I loan you money, I didn't need the Torah to tell me that you have to pay me back. I'm not going to read the rest in Tosfot inside, but he basically says, when it comes to a loan, you know you need to pay it back, even though the Torah says so, but it's not because the Torah said so. You just know, of course, you need to pay me back the exact amount right now. Damages, obviously, you have to pay, but you don't know how many damages. Torah describes how many damages. So all those things that you wouldn't have known otherwise had the Torah not written them, those are considered things that are written specifically in the Torah, and therefore there will be a lien for those things. Whereas things like a loan, where it's obvious you have to pay it back, and it's not because it says so in the Torah, that's considered not in the Torah, and that's why there's no shibud on that. Okay? Or you would have thought, it's not true. You would have thought there was no shibud on that, then maybe Shmuel would agree with Rabbi Yochanan and Rish Lakish, specifically in the korban case, okay? But only say that you're not obligated, there's no lien but for an oral loan because of that. Okay, we often distinguish in loans between oral and written. Okay, we're going to see why in a few minutes. But written loans, of course, can be collected from lien property. We're just talking about loans that were never written down. So that's the first tzricha. Now they say the iyashmin and bahan. If you had it in the case of the korban, you would have said bahat amar Rabbi Yochanan to milva k'tuva b'torah kich k'tuva b'shtar, because something written in the Torah, that's what we just read the Tosfot on, like, for example, the sacrifice, is as if it's written in a document, because written in the Torah, they have to do this. It's as if there was a document written about it. And that's why there's a lien on it. But you might have thought, when it comes to the case of an oral agreement about a loan, it's not from Torah law, it's just obvious. Maybe you would have thought that they agree with Shmuel that there's no lien there, and the orphans don't need to pay. So therefore, it's tzricha. That's why they each needed to say it. So again, we now have two situations where in both situations, Rish Lakish, or Rabbi Yochanan really, and Rish Lakish is at least mentioned in one, we assume he agrees in both, but Rabbi Yochanan is going to say in both of them, there's a lien, okay, by Torah law, and the orphans need to pay, or if you sell the property, they would need to pay, both for the sacrifice and for the loan that was oral. And you have Shmuel who says neither one needs to be paid by the heirs, okay, nor by anyone else. If the land was sold, you wouldn't collect from that sold property. Now they want to know, well, how do we rule on this? So Amarav Papa Hilchata, the halacha is milva alvet ma'alpeh, govem min hayorshim ve'eino govem min halekuchot. We now have a split. It's told like neither one of them really. Rav Papa says the halacha is when it's an oral agreement, you collect it from the heirs, but you don't collect it from lekuchot. You can't take it from lien property. Why is this? Govem na yorshim shibud deoraita ve'eno govem na lekuchot lekala. You collect from the heirs because shibud is a Torah law, but you can't collect from any buyers, anyone who bought my land or bought your land in the case I brought before. Why is that? Because they'll have no way of knowing. The whole idea of if I write a document down, I write it in a shtar, the assumption is it went through the court or people will just know there were witnesses on it, where we'll get around. So when you buy the land, let's say you're the one who owes me the money. Let's say you sell your land. When you go to someone to buy your land, they have to check, are there any liens on the property? Now, if it was just an oral agreement between you and me, they'll never find out about it. And then, first of all, people will never want to buy land, right? I'll never be able to sell my land. It's bad for the whole industry because you'll never be protected. So we have to protect purchasers so that things can happen. So basically, we do that, but we also collect from the heirs. Okay, by the way, and another sugya, it actually says the opposite, which is that, not the opposite, it's the same halacha, but for a different reason. You collect from the heirs because otherwise no one would ever loan money, okay? But you don't collect from buyers because of the basic law that shibud is not to oraita. So there's a whole different of understanding of this in a different sugya, but anyway, we'll stick with this. Vikone et atzma. So that was the third halacha of Rabbi Asi. Again, let's go through the three very quickly. Right, again, to review our daf, we finished with these two stories. The first was the Machzelet story from the previous page. And both these cases, we had this distinction between before he gives them, right, as he's giving the money, or after he gives the money, if he makes this comment about, oh, by the way, it's for your betrothal. And we had the second case where basically he takes something from her and then gives it back to her. Can she just say, oh, I was silent, right? How do we translate her silence? Was it just accepting the item? Okay, we saw different opinions about these cases. Then we moved on to the Rabbi Asi. We saw about land is not purchased with less than a shevet pruta. We saw that if you don't know laws of Tina Gerushim perfectly and you rule on them, you basically bring destruction to the world. And then we ended with this third case about whether lien property is Joraita or not, whereas Rabbi Asi was quoted as Rabbi Yochanan is saying shibud is a Torah law. So that means any obligation you have by Torah law is going to be, your property is going to have to pay that, which means that if you die, your heirs will have to pay that. Or if you sell land, you can collect it from that land. Okay, new section. Now we're moving to the end of, or later on in the first Mishnah. We're still dealing with the first Mishnah, even though we're already on Daf Yud Gimel. Konat atzma beget u'b'mitat haba. We're now going to have an interesting question. So the woman acquires herself either, meaning she can then go marry anyone she wants, either by divorce or by the death of her husband. Now, Bishlama get, we understand get, why? Because Dichtiv K'tav L'Sefer Kritut says, and he writes her a book that separates between them, right? And it's clear. And then she goes out of his house and she goes to marry someone else. It's very clear. But how do we get it that if the husband dies, she can marry anyone else? Now you say, this is really obvious. And that's going to be really the first answer the Gemara is going to give. But we're going to have 5 answers today about where we learn this from. And you're going to see it. It's not so obvious. Okay. Something that we take as a given. But they're questioning and they want to know where we get it from. First answer is Svarahu. It's very logical. Hu asara v'hi sharta. I'm sorry, v'hu sharta. He forbade her, and he basically, his existence, right? Once he betroths her, she becomes forbidden to everybody else. Until then, she was permitted to anyone she wanted to. He forbids her by kiddushin. So therefore, when he dies and he's no longer there, that obligation is gone. But the Gemara says, what do you mean? We have a precedent that doesn't necessarily do it. Death. Why? V'ha'arayot, isurei arayot. Okay, forbidden relations. Da'asr lehu, v'lo shari lehu. He forbids her, let's say he betroths her. Already she's forbidden to marry his father. And in fact, even if her husband were to die, she can still never marry the father. All the arayot apply even after the person's death, other than your wife's sister. Your wife's sister, if your wife dies, you can marry her sister, okay, a man's wife. But all the other arayot, he forbids her to them, but he doesn't permit her to them. So that answer doesn't work, because logic would state here, right? Just because he forbade her to someone doesn't mean that in his death, that forbidden prohibition is still in existence. Option number 2, Elamida Amar Rachmana, because the Torah says, Yivama. Okay, now we're going to learn it from laws of Yibum. Yivama she'en labanim, a woman who has no sons, asura. She's forbidden to any other man until she does yibum. Ha-yesh labanim, we can infer from here, if she does have sons, then, or children, muteret, she'd be permitted, because the whole thing is she can't marry anyone because she has to marry the Yabam. But if she doesn't have anyone, she has kids. She doesn't have to marry the Yabam. She can marry anyone she wants. To which the Gemara says, no, again, we can reject it. Maybe the whole chiddush of Yibum is she's forbidden to everyone, but actually is permitted to the brother because the brother has to keep on the name of his brother who died. But yesh labanim, but if she has sons, maybe l'kulei alma asura. Maybe she's still forbidden to everybody in the world. So that doesn't prove it. Option number 3. Well, the Torah forbids a Kohen Gadol, a high priest, from marrying a widow. Well, that would mean, and this seems pretty clear, Hala Kohen Hedyot Sharia. It would then seem that she could marry a regular Kohen, which means not only could she marry a regular Kohen, she can marry anybody, right? Just not a Kohen Gadol. To which the Gemara says, still it doesn't prove it. Maybe it's distinguishing and saying, listen, your husband dies, you can't marry Kohen Gadol, and if you do, it's a negative prohibition. And the rest of the world, it's just you can't do it. It's like a positive commandment, meaning it's a positive commandment for a man to only marry a woman who's never been married before, right? Never widowed, okay? Or divorced, but not widowed. Or, right, divorced or single, but not widowed. Maybe that's an aseh, so that you're basically transgressing. It's not a negative transgression. It's you're not keeping a positive commandment. So they say, "Hi aseh maya vidite." Wait, how would this aseh work exactly? Ida ahanya mitatabal. This whole thing doesn't make any sense. If the husband's death does something, well then tishtari lagamre, she should be permitted entirely. Ida lo ahanya, if it doesn't work at all, well then mitatabal tukma. If the husband's death doesn't do anything, then she should still be in her original transgression, which is it's negative because she's a married woman. In other words, either it works and then it works fully, or it doesn't work at all. How do we get to this middle ground where it lowers her level, right? So she's not really a married woman, but it's not fulfilling a positive commandment if she marries somebody else. Seems a little weird, to which they say, Alama lo. What do you mean? You could do something in between. You could end up with this in between case, which is lo afikte mimita ve'ukma ala se. It could be that the death of the husband lowers it. It basically says you still can't marry the Kohen Gadol. Okay, that you could have married before. Now you can't marry Kohen Gadol, but actually you couldn't have married him once you got married. But what it's doing is you're no longer an Esh Hadish. You don't get the death penalty if you sleep with another man, but it lowers you but you still can't do it. Okay? It's still it's a prohibition coming from a positive commandment. So how does he know that we could do such a thing? Again, back to precedent. We have a precedent for this somewhere else. Just like we have with sanctified items that get disqualified. Okay, for example, if I designate an animal to be used for a sacrifice, and then it becomes disqualified and I can't use it anymore, gets a blemish, let's say. To me, kara ilu me'ila. In the beginning, it has me'ila, okay, which is you'll have to bring korban if you misuse it, right? You use it for something else. And it's a sira begiz of avodan. You can't shear the animal and you can't work it. Parkinu, but once it gets disqualified and you redeem it with money, then the money is sanctified, no longer has sanctification. Me'ila leipu, it doesn't have me'ila, but since you had already designated as sacrifice, begiz of avoda asira. But you still can't shear it and you still can't work it. So here you see that something could cause something to drop down a level. So we're back to saying Kohen Gadol doesn't prove anything because it could be that it's still prohibited for her to marry another man, even though it's not a negative transgression. Okay, 2 more options. Ela mid'amar kra is an interesting one. Penya mupim l'chama v'ishacheri kachena. When the Kohen goes to talk to the people, the Kohen Mashuach speaks to the people before they go out to war. It says if a man just betrothed a woman, Mia isha sheri ras isha, who's someone who got betrothed to a woman, v'lo lekachani, didn't get marry her, yelech v'yashuv lebeito, should go home, penya mupim l'chama v'ishacheri kachena. Maybe you'll go out to war and someone else will take her. Okay, which sounds like if you were to die in war, someone else can marry her. To which, Matkifla Rav Shisha, that doesn't prove anything, he says, Bereda Rav Idi, the son of Rav Idi, Ema me. Man acher yabam. Maybe it means if you die and you don't have kids yet because you didn't yet marry her, well, your brother will take her. Maybe that's the other person. To which Amar of Ashi Shtei. I have two issues with what you're saying. What he's basically going to do is to have an issue with this rejection of this option number 4, which is going to then put option number 4 back on the table. And then he's going to bring option number 5. So the first thing he says is, Yabam lo ikre acher. We know in the pasuk about the Yabam, if you remember, if you learn Yabamot, it says you can't take another, right? You can't go marry another man, and it's called acher. But, right, because she has to marry the Yabam. The Yabam is certainly not called a different man. He's part of the same family, and he wouldn't be called acher. So that's number 1. So really, you could say we learned it from that pasuk, that if you die, she'll end up marrying someone else, meaning she can. And also, here's a 5th option. These are in the psukim about if she gets married and then divorced and then married to somebody else and then he decides to divorce her. It says, and he divorces her. Or even if that middle person died, and then the whole thing is that the first husband can't remarry her, but someone else can marry her. So what do you see here? Death is said in the same pasuk as divorce. Just like divorce severs the whole relationship and she can go marry someone else, likewise death does the same thing. So we now have 5 options from where we learn it. The first 2 were rejected, right? Logic, Yibum, widow to Kohen Gadol. Then we moved into the 2 that we kept, which is the message we say to someone, lest you go out to war and die, therefore you're exempt from going to war. You can stay married to your wife, right? Lest you die and she'll marry somebody else. So someone who had betrothed her but not yet married her. Or the second, the 5th one really, which was in the psukim about marriage, where it says, and the second husband doesn't want it, right? Ends up either divorces her or dies. So then we compare the 2. What's true for one is true for the other. She's then a free agent. So something that, again, was so obvious to you and I before we learned this stuff, but now we see where the rabbis actually derive it from. With that, we'll finish today's daf. Wishing everybody a Shabbat Shalom and a Shavuot Tov.